The topic of this lecture is point sets with attributes and volume modeling. In the previous lectures, we considered shape modeling as an area of computer science, which studies methods and tools for modeling point sets in geometric space. Now, we are starting to learn volume modeling. This part of computer science studies 3D point sets with attributes. Point sets are used for modeling physical and abstract objects and phenomena. Attributes of these objects can model properties of physical objects, such as photometric properties, opacity, color, reflectance, or material, density, temperature, and so on. So, volume model is presented as 3D point sets with point attributes. Each point in this model is presented as tuple of point coordinates in 3D space and array of attributes. Application areas of volume models increased in the last 2 decades. Volume modeling are used in following areas. Its fabrication of objects with multiple materials and varying material distribution. Physics-based simulation for the analysis of physical fields distribution over the given geometric areas. Analysis of geological structures. Medical examination and surgery simulation using computer tomography and other scanning devices. And visualization of objects with varying optical characteristics, amorphous and gaseous phenomena. Research in modeling point sets with attributes has been developing in several interrelated directions. Historically, separated treatment of geometry and attributes was introduced in computer graphics for rendering textured surfaces. Point sets are used for solid modeling. Solid modeling provides several representations of 3D point sets, such as boundary representation, polygonal or curvilinear boundary surface, constructive solid geometry, spatial occupancy enumeration, and other spatial partitioning schemes, voxel octrees, and so on. Also, generative models, parametric function representation, array representation, and others. Solid are considered to be homogeneous with constant attributes assigned to the entire solid. Primitive with attributes and operations on attributes are represented as extension of these modeling approaches. Real-valued functions of 3 variables, also called scalar fields, defined for point coordinates in 3D space, can be interpreted in 2 ways. In the first approach, such functions define a so-called implicit surface as a surface of constant function value, or isosurface. This surface may be considered as a boundary of 3D point set and can represent a homogeneous solid. In the second approach, real-valued functions define attributes, such as density, to model amorphous and gaseous phenomena. A volume can be thought as a subset of 3D space with an additional scalar value given to each its point. If this scalar value is interpreted as an additional point coordinate, the volume becomes a 4-dimensional high field or a hypersurface in 4-dimensional space. Scalar values can be given to the nodes of a regular space grid, voxel data, or to a non-regular grid. In the simplest case, only binary values 0 or 1 can be assigned to a grid node. This representation is well suited for mass properties calculation and other solid modeling applications. In volume graphics, this model is associated with voxelization procedures, supporting conversions of other models to binary voxel data. These are so-called homogeneous volumes. Heterogeneous volumes is an extension of the spatial occupancy enumeration with integer or real scalar values, which can be given in the nodes of a regular or a non-irregular space grid. Operations on voxel models include Boolean operations and linear transformations, transformation from one voxel data structure to another by manual 3D painting and carving, volume sculpting, metamorphosis, and morphological operations. Let's consider techniques of volume modeling. The first technique is a volume model. It is a trivariate relationship whose independent argument is a position in 3-dimensional space and whose dependent argument is a tuple of scalars or even a vector. The next technique is constructive volume geometry. In constructive volume geometry, a spatial object is defined as a tuple of scalar fields defined in 3D space. Special attention is paid to the first field in the tuple, which is an opacity field specifying the visibility of every point in space. Different visual or photometric attributes are discussed as color, ambient, diffuse, and specular reflection parameters. Several operations are introduced for the opacity field together with corresponding operations for the other attributes. Such operations as union, intersection, difference, blending, and so on. And finally, constructive hypervolume model. We will look at this technique in more detail later in the next lecture. This hypervolume model consists of a 3D point set with time, with additional dimensions as parameters, and with point attributes. Other words, it's time-dependent volume, or hypervolume. Each point is represented by the following tuple. The following aspects of different approaches we will consider now. Its model of a point set dimensionality, operations on point sets, type of attributes, attribute models, and operations on attributes. The details of the above mentioned approaches you can find in this article. Now let's consider three techniques of the constructive volume modeling. Its volume constructive solid geometry extension, constructive volume geometry, and volume scene graphs. You can learn more about the volume constructive solid geometry extension in these articles. Volumetric CSG model is an extension of CSG model which has extended CSG primitives such as standard algebraic primitives, boundary surface primitives, and objects extracted from voxel arrays using intensity thresholding. Also, this technique supports conversion of a CSG model into a voxel array and hardware support for rendering. The example illustrates the constructive tree of the shape represented in this figure. This call was introduced by CT data from thresholding operation, and further the set theoretic operations were applied. Threshold operation for intensity I at the point P is presented in this slide. This operation returns the volume with specified range on intensity. The procedure of the binary voxelization for volume CSG extension is following. We apply the point membership classification with respect to the CSG object for all sampling points in the volume space with simple rule. Intensity value is 1 an inside point, and intensity value is 0 an outside point. The algorithm of the point classification is presented on this slide. Rendering of the CSG volume is following. The binary volume is entered into the system texture memory. After that, the direct rendering is performed using 3D texture mapping. But there are following aliasing problems. The following three slides contain several examples of rendering of CSG volume models. Here are examples of number 1. Here are examples of number 2. Here are examples of number 3. The next technique is constructive volume geometry. You can learn more about this approach in this article. Let's say a few words about motivation for the appearance of the constructive volume geometry method. Conventional voxel-based modeling method has some drawbacks. Its lack of a high-level method for building complex objects from simple ones, and lack of a mature mathematical specification for combinational operations on volumetric datasets. On the other hand, schemes like CSG and implicit surfaces are unable to specify internal structures and to model amorphous phenomena. Constructive volume geometry is an algebraic framework used to model complex spatial objects using combinational algebraic operations. Components of CVG are following. A CVG algebra consists of a set of spatial objects and some operations on these objects. By specifying the operations of a CVG algebra and applying them to some spatial objects, more complex spatial objects are created. Let's consider how spatial objects are defined in CVG. First of all, let R denote the set of all real numbers, and E3 denote 3D Euclidean space. A scalar field is a function from E3 to R. A spatial object is a tuple of scalar fields defined in Euclidean space. An opacity field O specifies the visibility of every point P in Euclidean space. It's the most elementary field in CVG. Other attribute fields, from A1 to AK, are also scalar fields and can be colors, reflection coefficients, or non-graphical properties such as magnetic or distance. Operations on spatial objects. A CSG algebra is simply a spatial object class and a family of operations. Given a CSG algebra, we can choose some spatial objects and apply a sequence of operations to create a complex spatial object in the algebra. Operations defined upon spatial object can be decomposed into simple arithmetic operations on scalars through a series of operational decompositions. Opacity field determines the visibility of the object. Three basic combinational operations are allowed over the opacity field: its union, intersection, and difference. Here you can see the difference between constructive volume geometry and constructive solid geometry. CSG uses the binary logic of the point membership rule, which means that point either belongs to the shape or doesn't, and is consequently either visible or not. At the same time, CVG uses real function to determine opacity and visibility. Here you can see an example of applying basic CVG operation to two cubic spatial objects. O1 is of opacity 0.5 and is associated with a constant color. O2 is of opacity 1 and its color fields are interpolated. This is a second example of CVG operations over two primitives, cylinder C and sphere S. The union, intersection, addition, and two differences are illustrated on this slide. This is the third example of CVG operations. And this is the fourth example of CVG operations. Each head or skull is combined with the corresponding stool through a union operation before color mapping is applied. There are the following problems of CVG technique. The shape of an object does not necessarily predefine its photometric characteristics and vice versa. Also, this approach has limited operations, in particular min-max operations for set theoretic operations. But we discussed in previous lectures that min-max operations have drawbacks when applying transformation operations. And only static 3D objects are supported in this technique. Next approach of constructive volume modeling is volume scene graphs. The volume scene graphs are midway between data and functional scene descriptions. They are an explicit scene description reminiscent of CSG tree and related to independently developed CVG trees. Like CSG trees, leaves define shapes while interior nodes define compositing operators. Volume scene graphs extend CSG trees to support leaves containing volume dataset primitives and to support interior nodes that perform arbitrary filtering operations. Operational semantics also are defined to support sampling of the scene graph in a manner that is independent of the resolution and grid orientation of component data sets. Because of strong functional component of volume scene graphs, they are powerful but not directly renderable by graphics hardware. A volume scene's functions must be executed first to generate renderable voxels. Volume scene graphs may be thought of as a high-level scenes description that after evaluation yields low-level renderable quantities. A scene graph is a hierarchical organization of shapes, group of shapes, and groups of groups that collectively define the content of a scene. Shapes and groups may be shared among groups, creating a directed acyclic graph. Volume scene graphs support volumetric objects defined procedurally or by volume datasets of different resolution. Operators in VSG specify transforms, filtering, cutting, and so on. VSG are an explicit scene description reminiscent of CSG trees and related to CVG trees. This is an example of volume scene graphs. Here are three overlapping volume datasets at different resolutions. Each node in volume scene graph is a function that operates over f allocation of a point in space and time. S is a sample. It can be, for example, tuple of colors, red, green, and blue. The examples of nodes you can see on this slide. Volume scene graph describes scene content, not its rendering. In order to render, the scene must be voxelized. Scene graph voxelization samples the scene on a chosen grid. The size, orientation, and resolution of that grid may differ from that any child dataset. It means that scene's voxelization grid need not align with that of any child dataset. Any value can be replaced by a node evaluated in a location. Polygonal data may be incorporated into the scene graph using a surface distance node. The node computes a distance field that at each node in space returns the distance from the z point to the nearest point on the polygonal surface. The distance can be used with an interpolator to vary opacity with distance from the surface, or use turbulence to deform the surface. In this figure, distance fields for a smooth surface and with turbulence to deform the surface are presented. The following few slides illustrate example of nodes. This is an example of a spatial color gradient. Here is an example of using a color gradient to highlight contour. This figure shows a more complex example that visualizes the central region of the Orion Nebula. This scene uses procedural volume data derived from the analysis of nebula imagery. Operators colorize the volume using high-resolution Hubble imagery. Protosolar systems and shock fronts within the nebula are similarly built and composed together to form the full scene containing 2112 scene graph nodes. The Orion Nebula visualization was developed with the Hayden Planetarium at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City.